Hello and welcome. My name's Ken Calder and I'm connected with the Queensbury Baptist Church in Basford, Nottingham in the UK. The wisest of all humans once said, "There is a time to laugh." Well, in today's difficult and challenging times, it's particularly important to keep a cheerful perspective. So throughout this short series, please join me for a few chuckles as I'm thrown in at the deep end of pastoral life. We take a light-hearted peek behind the scenes of church life, plus some more serious stories of amazing answers to prayer. Now, in part one of this series, I spoke of the interesting individuals and amusing situations that awaited me at my very first church. And now, in part two, we continue with anecdotes from my early days as a naive young pastor, a greenhorn setting out to serve God in the community. But let me start on a personal note. I'll never forget becoming a first-time father. Ruth, my wife, was in the maternity ward at the Herts and Essex Hospital at Bishop Stortford, and the baby was due at any moment. In those days, it wasn't the custom for expectant fathers to be present at the birth. So during several nail-biting hours, I repeatedly telephoned the hospital ward to check on proceedings. Eventually, an authoritarian voice said, "Congratulations, it's a boy. Come in whenever you like." In euphoric mood, I travelled the 9 miles to Bishop Stortford, but on arrival, my joy was quickly dashed. I was ushered into an office and confronted by a tight-lipped matron who said quite bluntly, "The child has club feet." She then proceeded to paint a dark picture about the baby's future. Thoroughly dejected, we first-time parents met on the ward to commiserate. Now, in those days, very little was known about the treatment of talipes, so there seemed to be no light at the end of our tunnel. Eventually, barely coping, I staggered to the car to return home. The nurses' living quarters overlooked the hospital car park. All kinds of sounds filtered out of the apartments. As I stumbled shell-shocked across the tarmac, one of the nurses suddenly threw open a window, and a loud burst of song wafted across the car park from her domestic music centre. In the 1950s and 1960s, when the hugely successful Billy Graham rallies were being held in the UK, "He's Got the Whole World in His Hands" was a popular sacred song. That apartment window stayed open just long enough for one line of that song to pound my grateful ears. I distinctly heard the deep, rich voice of Bev Shea, Billy Graham's soloist, singing just 9 words. "He's got the little tiny baby in his hands." Then, abruptly, the window slammed shut, and I heard no more. But for me, at that moment in time, that sacred song shot to number 1 in the charts. The car park, the open window, and one line of a hymn, all combined to speak into a new father's dire and desperate situation. Coincidence? Someone once said, "Coincidence is God wishing to remain anonymous." Well, that time the incident filled me with confidence that God was aware of our emergency and would come to our aid. And God surely did. Following much prayer and a strenuous regime to correct those tiny twisted feet, our firstborn son grew up to follow a normal and energetic lifestyle. Now, when my wife and I married, times were hard and finances were tight. To save money, we initially lived with a relative in the town of Harlow, a few miles from the first church I served at. I rode a Vespa scooter to fulfill my church duties, but eventually managed to scrape together enough money to purchase a 3-wheeled car. And I set a bubble car with a single wheel at the rear. Now, the rear wheel was the weak point in the car design because it took all the weight of the passengers Wear and tear on the wheel bearing meant that the rear wheel eventually scraped noisily on its metal casing, so heads always turned wherever we travelled. Repairs were costly and often had to be put on hold. However, there was a way to alleviate the problem. It was a matter of balance. When the combined weight of driver and passenger was perfectly deployed over the rear wheel, we had a situation where quiet and carefree driving was guaranteed for a few hours. Ruth and I were quite used to sitting up stiffly and hardly daring to breathe, but the addition of a bonny bouncing baby upset the equilibrium. One bright summer's evening, we started back home after attending a convention service in London. We reached Wanstead without mishap, but then the rear wheel started to grate again. This time, all our physical contortions proved useless. The bubble car's metallic protest could be heard way down Wanstead High Street. But the car would run freely if I alone was perched gingerly at the very centre of the vehicle. There was only one thing to do. Ruth and the baby would use public transport while I coaxed our temperamental conveyance all the way home. We ground to a halt by a bus stop and climbed out to wait for a bus. Way down the road, a powder blue Rolls Royce pulled away from traffic lights and glided in our direction. The distinguished-looking driver halted his thoroughbred and leaned across the car to speak with me. Would we like a lift? We pointed at the bubble car in the curbside and told our sad story. No problem, the gentleman said. There's a strong rope in the boot. I'll give you a tow. Can you imagine such a journey? My little yellow bubble bouncing along precariously in the wake of opulence, while I hung grimly onto the steering wheel, trying to centralize my bottom. It all somehow seemed preposterous. The adventure of a lifetime was declined, but the lift for Ruth and our baby was gratefully accepted. Ruth's chauffeur turned out to be the chairman of Harlow Rugby Club, and he went out of his way to drop Ruth home right at the doorstep. Now, high-rise flats have been very much in the news in recent times. However, some 50 years ago, it was Ronan Point that was central to media attention. Ronan Point in the East End of London was some 22 floors high and had been officially opened only a few weeks previous. In fact, the new residents were still becoming acclimatized to their surroundings when terror struck one fine morning in the month of May. An explosion collapsed one corner of the building, and residents' furniture and personal belongings were hurled to the ground below. 4 of the residents were killed immediately, and 17 were injured. Mercifully, most of the flats above the point of explosion were still unoccupied, but one flat was occupied, and it is that particular dwelling that is central to a miracle in which I was privileged to play a small part. 1 week before the explosion, a stranger appeared at our church, and at the close of the service, I took the opportunity to chat with him. He was a lapsed believer who revealed in conversation that he visited London most weekends to enjoy the more seedier pleasures offered there. In order to indulge himself more readily in city nightlife, he arranged to stay with relatives in central London. However, the apartment only boasted 1 bedroom, so he would have to sleep in the lounge overnight. He was due to visit London the next weekend to stay with those relatives. Would I pray for him? He was aware he was leading an unsavoury lifestyle, but he felt too weak to change his ways. I did promise to pray for him on one condition, that he would show spiritual sincerity by immediately cancelling plans to visit London at weekends. So, with his promise to avoid the capital in future, we prayed together as he renewed his Christian vows and returned to the fold. A few days later, I came across him sitting in a car, newspaper in his lap, and tears rolling down his face as he pointed to the headlines. Gas explosion, Ronan Point. With the newspaper report, there were ghastly pictures showing the collapse of one complete corner of that high-rise building. Between his sobs, this man explained that his relatives lived at Ronan Point, high up on the southeast corner where the explosion occurred. On that fateful morning, his distraught and terrified aunt forced open her bedroom door to gaze straight down at the rubble in the street below. The lounge had completely disappeared. Auntie was left in terrible shock, staring out at blue sky. If that man had rejected the promptings of the Holy Spirit and visited his old haunts in London that weekend, he would have been sleeping in a lounge that collapsed and plunged to the concrete apron far below. He was certainly grateful that he saw the light and renewed his commitment to follow Christ. And that man is now a minister in one of the movements here in the UK. Well, that's it. Time's up. In part 3 next Wednesday, I'll tell you about the Polo Queen. If you like mints, you'll surely want to hear that story. I'll also be telling the story of the church car that could only be driven in reverse and how I had to eat humble pie after a confrontation with Billy Graham's song leader. Bye for now.